Hello and welcome to the online lecture for May 4th for History through 24 about empire. And what I want to quickly do here is just give you a sense of the nature of empire up through the mid-19th century. What I'm going to suggest for you is that there's a reshuffling of the European engagement abroad between the last part of the 1700s and 1850. There's a shift away from the New World, with good reason, as we'll see, and an emerging focus particularly on Asia. There's also a persistence of some settler colonization on the part of the British and the creation of a new settler colony in Algeria on the part of the French during this era. But I think the main point to take away is actually the lack of importance of empire, in the sense that no main European power in really up to 1850 pursues an aggressive policy of colonial expansion as a matter of state policy. Now, Great Britain obviously has the biggest foothold abroad of any of the European powers. But here, by and large, imperial engagement or colonization is carried out by private commercial actors like the British East India Company. It's not being run by the foreign ministry, by sort of the government in London itself. It's even though, of course, British troops end up involving themselves in adventures abroad, it's usually in the service of enforcing trade and in support of private companies, essentially. So while there is an increased European footprint in terms of commercial expansion around the globe up through 1850, and sort of increasing European settler colonies in places like Canada, Australia, lesser extent New Zealand, certainly in Algeria, still empire is not some sort of official matter of state policy, not nearly the way it will be, of course, by the 1870s and 80s. This image here that I begin with, of course, shows the state of colonial empires in 1763. And you see, of course, the role of the New World, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South and Central America, the North American colonies too, and then, of course, little pockets around the coast of Africa, and footholds in India. The Dutch East Indies, are otherwise known as Indonesia, are kind of a carryover from an earlier era. By and large, these are sort of trading posts and not really anything more than that. Well, the Napoleonic era, of course, the Napoleonic invasion of Spain and Portugal has the ironic effect of destroying particularly the Spanish control on its New World colonies. As a matter of course, in South America and in Central America, between the early 1800s and 1822, the Spanish lose all of their formal colonies, save for Cuba and the Philippines, but that's not in the New World. And the reason for this trend towards independence really is a reflection of the way, on the one hand, the Napoleonic invasion cuts contact with Madrid, between Madrid and the elites in the New World. Elites who come to realize that they're better off running their own show by themselves rather than having to funnel policy through Madrid. And then Spain's attempts to recapture control over these colonies after the Napoleonic period fall apart actually during that the 3-year period when the Parliament, the Cortes, has Ferdinand VII forced to make concessions. So, in fact, soldiers from Spain don't want to go fight and die in the Americas. So the wars of independence that come about in the New World are really a byproduct of the way the Napoleonic invasion of Spain and Portugal cuts contact with the mainland and really lets the elites in those colonies run their own show. It takes them a while to get to this revelation in certain places, like in Mexico. It happens later. But certainly by 1822, 1823, the Spanish no longer exercise control over their New World colonies. Likewise, Brazil becomes independent of Portugal in 1822. All that remains of the Portuguese Empire are some footholds in the coast of Africa, like Angola and Mozambique, and then footholds in India, like Goa and Macau off the coast of China. The Dutch, I'm talking about the older models of colonization that carry into the 19th century. The Dutch East Indies had been, began really in the 1600s, at the high water mark of the Netherlands, really as a global trading power. And they had kind of withered away. These were, like we'll see in the case with British India, like we already saw, this was really a private company, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, that had state backing, and that behaved kind of like a de facto state in its ability to wage wars and control territory. Really, its whole purpose in the 1600s and 1700s was to dominate particular commodities trades, the spice trades, pepper, mace, etc. Ironically, for the the Netherlands, the Dutch East Indies actually takes on a greater importance after 1830. Why, you might ask? Well, of course, in 1830, that the Dutch kingdom, which had been temporarily expanded after 1815, when the southern part of it, the largely French-speaking part of it, that is going to become Belgium, gets added to the Dutch crown. Well, in 1830, as we saw, the Belgium becomes independent, and so the Dutch economy suffers. A lot of revenue is being lost because there's no longer a profitable part of the country. It's been shorn away. And so there's a renewed emphasis actually on, from the state actually itself to make the Dutch East Indies much more profitable and to channel funds back to the Netherlands, which they do to the point where for much of the rest of the 19th century, the Dutch East Indies generate about 25% of the budget of the Netherlands itself. In the Dutch East Indies, and particularly on the island of Java, which is sort of the hotbed of Dutch control, there is the institution after 1830 of a new policy called in Dutch the Kulturstelsel, or Tanam Paksa in Javanese. Cultivation system or forced plantation, you can kind of guess at the implications of that. Basically, force native farmers to deliver a specified amount of crops like sugar or coffee as a tax, and they were essentially tied to the land. They really, it was an attempt to limit their ability to move around. So basically forced plantation labor, where native Javanese were having to basically turn all their efforts to cultivating cash crops. It is linked in the minds of Indonesians with a lot of starvation and hunger. It lasts into the 1870s, actually, so for our purposes, that's where I'll leave it there. Just also know that by the end of the 19th century, the Dutch East Indies really is a world powerhouse in producing coffee and sugar, but also things like rubber and tin. That's getting ahead of our story, though. So here we have sort of a carryover from an older model of empire that gets a little bit of more importance added to it after 1830 because of events back in Europe. Well, what about the French Empire? Well, the French certainly had some of their, they still had some of their sugar islands in the Caribbean, just not Saint-Domingue, as we saw. The focus of the French actually do expand dramatically in one place during this period, and that's Algeria, as the Jennifer Sessions reading makes clear. And you might look at this and say, hey, this sounds like it's directly contradicting what you just said earlier in the lecture, that the Europeans don't make much of an effort to expand their empire as a matter of state policy during the first half of the 19th century. And that still holds true because really the conquest of Algeria comes about by accident. Well, not necessarily accident, but Algeria, which had been sort of a Western outpost, loosely part of the Ottoman Empire. The French invade in 1830 essentially as a pretext on the part of the French king, Charles X, who was part of the way the Bourbon family had been restored after 1815. Part of a pretext to try to ward off his unpopularity. The invasion of Algiers and then Algeria is quote-unquote successful in the sense that the French gradually established control. It's not successful enough to keep Charles X in power because, as we saw in 1830, he's pushed out and a constitutional monarchy headed by Louis Philippe is put in his place. In Algeria, the Jennifer Sessions piece, I think, gives a nice window into the attitudes that the French come up with about colonization. Certainly there's a sense that this is a nice break from what is increasingly seen as a bad model of previous empire, a bad model characterized by slavery, among other things, in the Caribbean. And I'll let you think about that as we go forward. But I should also point out, and Jennifer Sessions does too, that the fantasies about Algeria, but what it could become, are all made possible also by violence. There's essentially a 15, 17-year pacification campaign that the French army engages between 1830 and 1847 to bring much of the territory off the ocean of Algeria under French control, and this involves pushing the native Algerians and Berbers, a specific ethnic group, off their lands in the face of pretty fierce resistance, doing things like destroying farmlands, smoking people out of caves, basically asphyxiating them in caves. It's a very, very violent process of subduing Algeria, basically, in order to make it into what the French think it might become. And that resistance is headed by a man named Emir Abdelkader, who successfully kind of keeps the French at bay until 1847. Interestingly, there's a town in Iowa named Abdelkader, which I think is actually named after this guy. Seems kind of random. I don't think it was settled by Algerians, but I'm sure it was settled by refugees from 1848. The revolutions of 1848 who come to the U.S. In the mid-19th century, and sort of looked to Qatar as a model for fighting for rights, etc. Anyway, okay, so the point here is that Algeria does, this is sort of a one prominent example of colonial expansion in the first half of the 19th century. But again, it's mostly done by accident, and it kind of evolves into something for France that never really was intended beforehand. Otherwise, of course, the British are have the biggest foothold abroad, and as we saw in our readings for Wednesday about intermarriage between the British East India Company and between British East India Company officials and noble women in India, that first of all, the British presence in India was that of a private company that devoted to increasing its profit, but a private company that had kind of the attributes of a formal government in the fact that it controlled territory, had an army, and was busy sort of expanding its direct reach. But we also talked about how loose this was in the sense that the BEIC really only controlled directly that territory in pink, the presidencies of Madras and Bengal. And then for the rest, it was a kind of a patchwork set of alliances with other princely states, with Indian rulers themselves. Now, gradually over the 19th century, the British will come to exercise, the British East India Company will come to exercise greater control over those princely states and, in fact, incorporate some of them. But still, as we saw, really at the beginning of the 19th century, and even onward for a while, the British don't have a lot of ability to directly impose their will, and so that's why they have these coalitions and informal and alliances. India, of course, is probably the most important part of the British foothold abroad. But again, it's the work of a private company with sort of public attributes and that gets support from the British government. So again, empire is kind of expanding here, but it's really not a coherent policy from London. Also in this period, though, I do want to point out that there are a couple parallels to the situation in Algeria, that is to say, settler colonies. The British have three main settler colonies in the first half, well, two main ones in the first half of the 19th century that'll become more and more important, three by the end of the 19th century. And those are what are often called the White Dominions: Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And actually, so here's your moment for Canadian history in this class. I'm sure you're excited, and Australian history too. So here what I want to show is that this was an older colonial presence that gets transformed in the first half of the 19th century by settlement. Okay, Canada, British North America. Really quickly, the main provinces, really the nature of what we know as Canada in the late 18th century and early 19th century is very particular, because you have the three eastern provinces: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. Well, actually, there's actually four: Prince Edward Island, which is too small to see here, and Newfoundland. These are all, well, actually, let me walk that back. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Cape Breton Island, which is part of Nova Scotia. These are all kind of extensions of New England, sort of Boston, sort of Massachusetts north. A lot of the colonists there in the 18th century had actually come from New England. Whereas Newfoundland, dangling out there into the Atlantic Ocean, is really the western outpost of the British fishing industry. About 200,000 people live total in what are called the Maritime Provinces. Regardless, they're all really oriented towards Great Britain, and they're not very connected towards the inward provinces, Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Lower Canada, by the end of the century, is the most densely populated part of British North America. Except ironically, 80% of the 350,000 people who live there are French speakers. And this is, of course, a big problem for governance. It's the legacy of the French presence before 1763 there. Upper Canada, further to the west, had only 90,000 people at the end of this period, at the end of the 18th century. In Lower Canada, despite the fact that this is under British control, it looks actually a lot like France before the Revolution in the sense that they're sort of feudal land ownership patterns, despite efforts to get rid of them. And this persists all the way to the 1850s. Further west, what's called on this map Rupert's Land, that's actually the domain of the Hudson's Bay Company, which is still busy looking for resources, particularly fur. At the beginning of over the course of the 19th century, there's also a little foothold on the very western coast, what's going to become British Columbia. There aren't huge numbers of native people present already by the beginning of the 1800s, most of whom have already been decimated by alcohol and disease, and also by the fact that there were fewer in what is now Canada than in the United States to begin with, because of topography and weather. Overall, moving forward, over the course of the 19th century, the British North America, what comes to call itself Canada, is tied very closely to Great Britain by trade and by attitude. People there see kind of connection to Great Britain as a way of not being American. There's a steady flow of migrants, particularly from Great Britain, to Canada. A lot of Irish come to Canada, particularly in the late 1840s, after the Irish potato famine. That's going to spike upwards in the second half of the 19th century, just like immigration is going to spike up everywhere. The big development I want to stress for you in terms of this as a settler colony, again, not that we care that much, but we do a little bit, is that there is a move towards a little bit of self-government in Canada over the course of the 19th century, capped by the Act of Confederation in 1867, which ties together the two of the maritime provinces, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and the two western provinces, at the time Ontario, Lower Canada and Upper Canada, which become Quebec and Ontario, respectively. There still really isn't a huge sense of Canadian identity here, but there is a growing sense of sort of responsible, that the sort of the male settlers there are governing themselves. And there had been some revolts in the 1830s, first by French speakers and then by people in Ontario who were upset at government corruption. So the big trend here is that Canada kind of steadily emerges as a settler colony, one with a very British identity, despite the fact that there are a lot of French folk there, French-speaking folk there, up through the 19th century. And Canadianness, the idea of sort of pride in Canada, that's really not a product until the early 20th century. Moving rapidly here, what about Australia, you ask? Well, I tell you, quite rapidly. I think we have in our minds the creation myth of Australia as a convict destination, a place where the British initially sent sort of their poor working class quote-unquote criminal population. And that's sort of true. But in 1815, sort of fast forward to this one, there really are not very many Europeans in Australia. There are 15,000 of them. There are 500,000 Aboriginals, and that's already down from 1.5 million basically the 30, let's say half century that Europeans had been sniffing around down here. And that's primarily due to disease that ravages the Aboriginal population. Just to fast forward to 1861, there are 1 million European colonists, 250,000 Aboriginals and Islanders. The population of both Australia and the outlying islands to its northeast had been ravaged by disease. The population is growing mostly by migration, not by transportation of criminals. The transportation of convicts to Australia ends between 1840 and 1868, depending on what province you're in. Most of the migrants to Australia are British, although about a tenth of them in the 1950s are Chinese coming in for the gold rush. As Australia grows, it's a little bit like Canada in the sense that there are increasingly a bunch of separate colonies. So we'll fast forward here to the 1850s. South Australia and Victoria, by the way, originate as settler colonies, as opposed to New South Wales, Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania, which is now Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania, and Western Australia, which were all convict colonies initially. Of course, this map makes it look like it's enormous, but of course the European presence was pretty much in a few towns on the coast for a long time. Anyway, the number of provinces will grow in Australia, and I haven't included all the ones for the second half of the 19th century, but you get the idea. But often these provinces, have their own distinct identity, distinct economies. Even in the 1850s, as there's a move to kind of emulate the Canadian model and have responsible government, that is to say, a lot of self-autonomy at home. Many of these provinces were better connected to Britain than they were to each other, either culturally or in terms of like economic ties, like railroads. So that's what I want to say about Australia. Australia emerges as a migrant colony, as a colony for migration over the course of the 19th century, and certainly the early beginnings as a convict colony are then overshadowed as a destination really for emigration. In New Zealand is a little bit behind the other two here in the sense of the presence of Europeans, British or English speakers usually, as a settler colony, because up to 1840, the European presence is really minimal. There are like 2,000 Europeans here, mostly whalers, traders, other kinds of merchants. And also, unlike the Australian mainland, and really also unlike Canada, there is still a native population that is very vigorous and well organized up until the 1840s and 50s, the Maori. And in 1840, New Zealand is theoretically annexed to Great Britain after 50 plus years of contact between sailors, whalers, sealers, people looking for seals, traders, missionaries, and the Maori. And the Maori are seen as very, very formidable. So the Treaty of Waitangi, which creates New Zealand essentially as a bicultural society, gives the Maori guaranteed possession of the land, forests, that they were the exclusive purchaser of land, that they had sort of exclusive selling and purchasing rights, and that they would receive the rights and privileges of British subjects. Really interesting. And this map gives you a sense, I think, of the various locations in which the treaty is theoretically signed. And again, this is a moment where the population is horribly imbalanced in the sense, from the British point of view. There are about 2,000 Europeans and 70 to 90,000 Maori. So not huge, I suppose, demographically, but certainly that ratio is very strikingly not in the favor of the Europeans. Still in the 1840s and 50s, there is a growing outmigration of British folk to New Zealand. And this causes ongoing issues with the Maori as the whole question of land access becomes very, very fraught. And the Maori, of course, aren't one group in that sense. They all have different clans and chiefdoms. And so they're not sort of a monolithic font of resistance against the British. Still, there are a series of wars in the 1860s, a little bit after our period here, that are going to resist British incursions and are going to point back to this treaty as something that's being violated. The net result by the end of the century is a very European settler colony. Just to give you numbers, in 1858 there are about 60,000 whites and about 56,000 Maori, so the balance is tipped. By 1896 there are 700,000 Europeans and 42,000 Maori. So all of these, then Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Algeria are settler colonies, but with different dynamics. And of course, the British ones are all, and I think all of these are, well, Algeria is a little bit different because it's sort of this well-established, highly organized, highly urbanized society. In the case of British North America, Australia, and New Zealand, you have sort of the late 18th century beginnings, sort of more informal or sort of driven by trade, that are eventually transformed into a process of settlement. Okay, so those are the big points I wanted to make about that part of the presence of empire. Well, just a couple other things to keep in mind about the European expansion abroad in the first half of the 19th century is that, again, it's not really a matter of official state policy. It's largely driven by economic concerns, and China is a really good indicator of this, right? Where certainly British merchants and merchants from other parts of the world too really want in on the Chinese market in the first half of the 19th century. The Qing state is able to keep them at bay for quite some time until the flashpoint of conflict, the First Opium War, between 1838-39 and 1842, where basically the British East India Company is using opium to crack the Chinese market and get silver that it's using sort of for its own purposes. So again, private economic actors who are turning to sort of a little bit of official British military support. I'm pretty sure it's the British East India Company's India Army that's tromping around in China during the Opium War. In any case, the outcome of the war forces the Chinese state to open up 5 treaty ports to British access, and then later other Europeans and North Americans, where those Westerners can stay all year round. They don't have to go back to Macau for half the year as they did before. So this really breaks down China's isolation. And again, this is a moment of kind of European expansion, but it's done in the service of essentially facilitating free trade. Well, free trade, of course, which benefits the British and not others. And I think that that's really the kind of a good model to keep in mind. Yes, there are sort of these moments where the European foothold abroad is expanding. And then certainly you see that a couple of these settler colonies as growing during this period. But by and large, the European footprint up till the 1850s is largely a commercial one in Asia, certainly in Africa, where they're, with the exception of India, where the British are ratcheting up their engagement. But again, this is still a private company carrying out its business with support from the state back in London. So empire in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, not the same thing that we'll see later on where it's a matter of formal state policy. Okay, I want to conclude. One other point I can make about this is that the Opium Wars usher in an era of Western powers forcing China to capitulate to increasingly their demands. One other point that I would actually like to raise here at the end is I would actually like you to email me. I said there wasn't a discussion board, and there's not, but I would like you to sort of verify that you've paid attention to my ramblings here and that you've at least glanced at the sessions reading. So the question I'd like you to respond to, just shoot me an email with a sentence or two. What were some of the factors that motivated French intellectuals to call for the transformation of Algeria into a settler colony after 1830? Send that answer to me via email before Monday's class, if you could. And otherwise, that's all I've got for right now. So have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday.